Hello, I'm Joanne Diaz.
And I'm Abram Van Ingen.
And this is Poetry for All.
And today we have a special episode on Mary Sidney and her translation of Psalm 52.
Psalm 52. Tyrant, why swell'st thou thus of mischief vaunting, since help from God to us is never wanting? Lewd lies thy tongue contrives, loud lies it soundeth, sharper than sharpest knives with lies it woundeth. Falsehood thy wit approves, all truth rejected. Thy will all vices loves, virtue neglected. Not words from cursed thee, but gulfs are poured, gulfs wherein daily be good men devoured. Thinkest thou to bear it so? God shall displace thee, God shall thee overthrow, crush thee, deface thee. The just shall fearing see these fearful chances, and laughing shoot at thee with scornful glances. Lo, lo, the wretched wight, who God disdaining, his mischief made his might, his guard his gaining. I, as an olive tree, still green shall flourish. God's house the soil shall be, my roots to nourish. My trust in his true love, truly attending, shall never thence remove, never see ending. Thee will I honor still, Lord, for this justice. There fix my hopes I will, where thy saints' trust is. Thy saints trust in thy name, therein they joy them. Protected by the same, naught can annoy them.
Boom. There you go.
Yeah.
Psalm 52. And, maybe we should just begin by, so obviously she did not write Psalm 52, but she translated it and turned it into this amazing English poem. And maybe we should begin by thinking about who Mary Sidney was. Can you tell us a little bit about who she was and why she's doing this?
Yes, she was an amazing person. She was born in 1562. She died in 1621. She was an English subject. She was a poet, a collaborator, an editor, a translator, and a literary patron. She could do all of these things because she was a member of one of the most important literary families in all of English history. Her brother, Philip Sidney, he was sort of like the JFK of the English Renaissance. He was sort of the golden boy. And we can talk about that another time too. But she had this magnificent brother, enormously talented Philip Sidney. He wrote one of the most important sonnet sequences of the English Renaissance, Astrophil and Stella. And that was an early influential sonnet sequence of the English Renaissance. Her niece, Mary Roth, wrote another sonnet sequence, which was called Pamphylia to Amphilanthus. Many years later, her distant relative, George Herbert, became one of the great devotional poets of the 17th century. And Mary Sidney herself was an influence on many other poets of her time.
I love it. Yeah, and you can hear that influence throughout this poem. There are echoes of this poem in all kinds of poems, starting with that first line, right? Why swell'st thou so? This is a line that a lot of people might recognize from John Donne's Holy Sonnet 10, right? Death be not proud, why swell'st thou then? And so on and so forth. He's borrowing this language, but it wasn't exactly plagiarism. It was just the way that poetry worked, right? So they're writing these manuscripts, they're circulating these manuscripts, they're sending them all around. Everybody is sort of chipping in, pulling from it, using what works, sending it around, reading and learning. This was the way that poetry functioned at the time, through manuscripts and manuscript culture.
I love that you're emphasizing that. We in the 21st century spend much of our time scrolling through digital texts, right? But imagine, if you will, maybe a notebook or a hand-sewn cluster of pages, maybe not too much bigger than your smartphone. So maybe imagine something 4 by 6 inches or maybe 5 by 7 inches. When we say circulating by manuscript, these were friends that were part of a literary culture where they would be in the court, say, of Queen Elizabeth or King James, and they would share their poems in process with each other and maybe provide feedback to each other. Maybe if I was friends with you, I might copy your poem into my commonplace book. You might do the same with my work. And this is how the work among these highly affluent, highly powerful poets, how this work circulated well before it circulated in print. That's very important.
And the thing circulating here is a translation, which again is pretty common at the time. That is to say, it was an art form practiced by all these great literary figures because translation is itself a kind of art. All kinds of people were translating the Psalms, right? So Martin Luther, Theodore Beza, Matthew Parker, Thomas Wyatt, all these people. Queen Elizabeth I, Anne Locke, Anne Askew, so all these women were doing it too. And in fact, in the 16th century, there's 90 English versions of the Psalms that are in circulation.
Did you say 9-0?
9-0, that's correct.
Why were people so upset? So 90 English versions of the Psalm. Why are the Psalms so compelling as a source of inspiration for these writers to translate?
What you get out of the Psalms, I mean, so much of poetry works this way, but the Psalms in particular have this element where they might be tied to a particular incident. They might have come out of a particular occasion, but they can be read much more broadly, applied much more broadly. You get that in this Psalm. So this is a Psalm that is by David, tied to a particular person who he's thinking of as the mighty man who has to fall, who did this terrible massacre and so on. So David is actually writing this in response to a particular occasion. But the way the psalm is written, it can be used to think about any evil tyrant, any unrighteous person with power who must fall for the sake of justice.
Wow. Okay. I love what you're saying about even if the psalm was written in a particular time, a particular political situation, there's a sense of transferability and the way in which this psalm can ripple across time periods and geographies because it's just generalized enough. Its insights into tyranny and power are broad enough that they can be translated and be quite effective in a lot of contexts, right?
Yeah, and two things about that are worth noting. First, translating was itself something of a political act. I mean, it wasn't long before that people were being killed for translating scripture into their own tongue. From 1408 to 1525, it was illegal in England to do this kind of work. So translating is itself kind of touchy still. But the other thing that she's doing is she's translating a psalm about tyrants. And that is a inherently political move, right? We're talking about evil tyrants and God's gonna come for them. Well, who counts as an evil tyrant and how do you think about that, right?
Oh, this is not. And, the more I hear you talking and the more I learn about this context, there's one more element to this that we haven't yet talked about. And we got to get into the poem. I know that. But before we get into the poem, I know, I'm just so excited. I think so. Generally, you see a lot of women writers engaging with psalm translation in the 15 and 1600s. And I think there was this sense that this was appropriate material for women to translate these psalms in private, that this kept them out of the public sphere. They weren't printing these, they were handwriting them and circulating them among friends, and that felt appropriate for women who ought to be chaste, silent, obedient, okay? But everything you're saying about this poem suggests that actually if you read the lines and really think about what the psalm is saying about tyranny, this is actually a really exciting poem, right? And an exciting poem for a woman poet who is a part of the court of a tyrant to think about and explore, no?
It's worth noting that King James I, one of the reasons we have the King James Bible is because the Bible that Mary Sidney was working with, the Geneva Bible, had all of these notes about tyrants in it. It had these moments in it where it was sort of saying that it's okay to resist your king if your king is not doing what is godly. Well,
God.
the king did not really so much like that and did not really like those notes. And one of the reasons he called for a new translation of the Bible was to get rid of all of those notes. And so this is one of the Bibles and one of the versions of the Psalms that are lying there before Mary as she's working on this and figuring out this poem and doing it in her own style.
This is great. So we've talked about this more than once on this podcast, how translation is not just a word-for-word transaction that's occurring. Every translator is making very important editorial and creative decisions. There is no perfect translation from the Hebrew Psalms into English, so each translator has their own priorities, and what you're describing is just fascinating to me.
Well, and the artistry that she puts into this is astounding to me. I mean, she is a very good poet. And so maybe we should just jump into it and get into some of the lines and some of the things that she's doing here.
Okay, so I want to read the first quatrain, the first 4 lines, and maybe you can tell me what you hear that's so dynamic, right? Tyrant, why swell'st thou thus, of mischief vaunting, since help from God to us is never wanting?
Right, so you have the call out at the beginning, right? Tyrant. I mean, this powerful beginning. And then what we have is what we call a caesura, basically where you stop in the middle of a line, and it stops right after tyrant, right? So tyrant, comma. All the attention is focused on this tyrant, and we know exactly what it is that we're dealing with, a tyrant, right? So then after the caesura, we have, why swell'st thou thus? And you have these, each of these things are emphasized, right? It's almost as though every word is stressed. Why swell'st thou thus? So that it's like as strong and confident a first line as you could possibly imagine.
That's nice. And, a lot of times, and maybe you've had this experience with your own students, when you're introducing them to poetry from the 15 and 1600s, there are several challenges to when you encounter a poem like this. One is copiousness, and by that I just mean there are ways in which these sentences can be quite ornate and might be articulated in multiple ways rather than a very simple direct utterance. The other challenge is inverted syntax.
Yes.
Right? So you got to look for the verb, and you got to figure out what words are being rearranged in the syntax that we expect versus the order of words that we get. So, tyrant, why swell'st thou thus, of mischief vaunting? Since help from God to us is never wanting. God's help is, we never want for God's help, should be the sentence. But it says, since help from God to us is never wanting. So she lands on the never wanting, and she's doing that to emphasize the fact of the abundance of God's help and love. But it sounds a little foreign to our modern ears, but it's once you get used to it, then you can see what she wants to emphasize, right?
And in the next quatrain, you get that inverted syntax again, but here it's doing a lot of work because it's specifically about lying. And lying, of course, is being twisted. And the sentences and the syntax in this stanza are being twisted. And so you get lewd lies, thy tongue contrives, loud lies, it soundeth, sharper than sharpest knives with lies, it woundeth. I mean, that's just incredible. That's amazing.
It's great. And we should call attention to this. Let's call attention to the sense first. Again, let's uninvert that syntax, right? Basically, the sense of the stanza is you tell lewd lies, you contrive lewd lies, and they sound very loud. Not only are you lying, but you're loud when you do it. And the lies are sharper than the sharpest knives. You wound us with your lies. But instead, look where she lands. And look at the sounds. Look at the alliteration. Lewd lies thy tongue contrives. Loud lies it soundeth. Sharper than sharpest knives with lies it woundeth.
What makes the sounds so effective is their repetition. So we have lies, 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 lewd, loud, sharp, sharp, contrives, knives, right? So the part of the building of the poem is her kind of brilliant use of repetition in various places throughout it. And here, the the incessant nature of those lies is brought out not just by repeating the word lies 3 times in 4 lines, but by rhyming it throughout that entire stanza. So let's get the sense of the next quatrain. And remember, she is moving through the psalm. The psalm has 9 verses in it. She has 11 stanzas. And so that itself is interesting, and we'll get into that in just a moment. But this is the next one. Falsehood thy wit approves, all truth rejected. Thy will all vices loves, virtue neglected. So what is she saying in plain English?
Again, if you rearrange that syntax, she's basically saying your wit approves falsehood and rejects truth. Your will loves vice and neglects virtue. What do you make of that?
So she's just laying out the sort of evil of this person, right? And it isn't just about deeds done. It's about the will itself. What does this person love? Augustine famously said, if you want to know a person, don't ask what they believe, ask what they love. And here you get the sense that this person loves vices. That's how we know it's a tyrant.
Okay, can we just sit for a moment with that quote by St. Augustine? Oh my God, I don't know if I know that quote. Is it really famous to everyone except for me?
I don't know. Maybe.
I mean,
sure.
Shoot, does that mean that if I love the Mets, that tells you something about me?
Yes, indeed. Everything you need to know.
What? That's so interesting. Okay, so are your inner feelings, your inner thoughts, and then your actions, there's a real sense of corruption there. Okay, then the next stanza, not words from cursed thee, but gulfs are poured, gulfs wherein daily be good men devoured. Oof, what do you make of that? What does that mean, first of all?
So it's interesting. I mean, in a way, it picks up on the lies stanza, right? But the fact of these lies being poured forth every day are actually creating these gulfs in which good people are devoured. I mean, it's almost as though you're etching these canyons into the earth with your horrible lies, and people are falling into them, like falling into these traps over and over again.
And then, think'st thou to bear it so? God shall displace thee. God shall thee overthrow, crush thee, deface thee. Talk about how repetition works in this quatrain.
So one of the things you see happening here, we've talked many times about how a lot of poetry has turns. This poem has a turn, right? So a lot of it is about the tyrant, and then suddenly it's about God. Think'st thou to bear it so? It's a question that returns us to the question at the beginning, right? Why swell'st thou so, right? Do you think this is going to go on forever? And then the emphasis, again, the way that she moves words around allows her to stress the God, because she starts with it and it's stressed. God shall displace thee. God shall thee overthrow. And the thee is also placed in all these stress places and repeated 3 times through these 3 lines. God shall displace thee. God shall thee overthrow. Crush thee, deface thee. 4 times, right? So God's coming for you, right? There's no getting around it. And the repetitions and the stresses and the movement of the words here emphasizes it.
She wanted to emphasize overthrow. She wanted to emphasize usurpation, right? So by having that as one of her end words, she created variation within the repetition and also emphasized that one day this tyrant will be overthrown.
The other thing you notice Sidney doing here is, I mean, she is building out the imagery that's offered to her in the Geneva Bible that sits before her, right? So we move from what she would have read, which is like God's going to destroy you, to God's going to overthrow, crush, and deface you, right? And we build out the imagery of the awfulness of this person with the language of gulfs that swallow people. I mean, all of this is imaginative expansion on the actual text that is in front of her. It's not untrue to what the text is, but it's not there in the text before her. So this is a translation that's making much more concrete, much more visual, and much more vivid the actual terror of this tyrant and the tyrant's destruction.
Oh, that's nice. And, there's a scholar from decades ago, Reed Wade Dazenbrock, and he had this phrase, not just translation, but transformation. And I feel like that's appropriate to a lot of the poetry of this period, but certainly what you're describing here.
Absolutely. And so next we get the just, right? So we turn from the tyrant's destruction to the just person. The just shall, fearing, see these fearful chances, and laughing shoot at thee with scornful glances.
I also love how this poem has a prophetic use of the future tense, right? The just shall, fearing, see these fearful chances. So the poem begins in the present tense, the habitual present tense, and then after that turn, here are the things that shall happen, and that creates the poet as a kind of visionary, someone who can see the future when this tyrant is overthrown. It's very powerful, no?
Then we move into the imagery that is all over the Psalms, the first Psalm and forward, this imagery of the just person being like a flourishing tree rooted by a spring or a river. I, as an olive tree, still green shall flourish. God's house, the soil shall be, my roots to nourish. And it goes on with this image into the next stanza as well. My trust in his true love, truly attending, shall never thence remove, never see ending. And the reason I say it goes on is because this is one of those moments where she actually takes a verse and expands it into two stanzas instead of one. Everything else has been one stanza, one verse, one stanza. Now we get two stanzas for one verse, and that itself is an interesting choice. And what it suggests is that she wants to slow us down, to sit with us in this imagery of this peaceful olive tree flourishing, to sit in this imagery of the just person really thriving and in a kind of abundant peace.
Oh, that's really nice. I like that figuration quite a lot. There's a sense of peace, of justice, of order, of abundance that is currently lacking in this earthly tyrant, right?
Mm-hmm. And the next stanza is the last verse of the psalm, and this is the way it goes. Thee will I honor still, Lord, for this justice. There fix my hopes I will, where thy saints' trust is. Now, I say this stanza is the last verse of the psalm, and it is, but it is not the last stanza of the poem. And that is interesting in its own right. But first, we can just notice that this is a kind of rounding out, right? I'm going to honor you for this justice, Lord, that you know is coming, right? The poet is saying it shall come. It hasn't arrived yet, but there is this sense of confidence that it will come, and that therefore it's about hopes in the end. There fix my hopes I will, where thy saints trusted. That is where the saints put their trust. I'm going to do the same.
That's great. And then that's continued in Mary Sidney's final stanza, right? Thy saints trust in thy name, therein they joy them, protected by the same, naught can annoy them.
Right. And so what you see in this final stanza is what in this period was often called an argument, or basically a summary. And so she has added to the translation a summary of the psalm as a whole. And she's done it by pulling from the last line and repeating it with a difference. So where thy saints' trust is becomes the next line and the beginning of the argument, the beginning of the summary. Thy saints trust in thy name, therein they joy them, protected by the same, naught can annoy them. And so this is sort of like the moral of the story, right? The takeaway, the argument, the summary, but it is not in the original psalm. So this is again an addition to translation in the art of translation itself.
There's sort of a didacticism there. There's sort of a way in which there's a moral to the story. Not something that's common in contemporary poetry, but very common in this period and very valuable.
Yeah, and I would emphasize, though, that this moral doesn't work on its own. That is to say, if you just take this stanza and, I don't know, pin it on a wall, maybe it will convey something to you, but it will not convey the force of the poem itself. You've got to start with that first line, Tyrant, why swell'st thou, right? You've got to go through the way that her syntax, her inversions, her repetitions. It's the experience of the poem that makes the poem, not the moral. Poetry is so much about bringing alive the very experience, the confidence of this poetic speaker. And the only way to get to that confidence is through the poem itself, through the reading of the poem, through the sound of it, through all the poetic devices that it's using to make the experience real.
Oh, that's really great. So with all that we've talked about and thought about here, would you be willing to read the poem again?
Absolutely. Psalm 52 by Mary Sidney. Tyrant, Why swell'st thou thus, of mischief vaunting, since help from God to us is never wanting? Lewd lies thy tongue contrives, loud lies it soundeth, sharper than sharpest knives with lies it woundeth. Falsehood thy wit approves, all truth rejected, thy will all vices loves, virtue neglected. Not words from cursed thee, but gulfs are poured, gulfs wherein daily be good men devoured. Think'st thou to bear it so? God shall displace thee, God shall thee overthrow, crush thee, deface thee. The just shall, fearing, see these fearful chances, and laughing shoot at thee with scornful glances. Lo, lo, the wretched wight, who God disdaining, his mischief made his might, his guard his gaining. I, as an olive tree still green, shall flourish. God's house, the soil shall be my roots to nourish. My trust in his true love, truly attending, shall never thence remove, never see ending. Thee will I honor still, Lord, for this justice. There fix my hopes I will, where thy saints' trust is. Thy saints trust in thy name. Therein they joy them, protected by the same, naught can annoy them.
That was great. Thank you for reading that again. We love Mary Sidney, and we hope that you'll want to learn more about her and her time period, women's writing, translation of the Psalms. If you're interested in these things, we hope that you'll visit our website. And if you don't already subscribe to our podcast, we hope you will. And please leave us a review so that we know how we're doing.
Thank you all for listening.